Oh, between us, we
These
probably won't
girls
run out
know
of anything to say. Are you ready?
We're ready.
Okay. What's the date, y'all?
28.
Today is November the 28th, 2001. We're at the Old Jail Museum, and we're here this afternoon to do an oral history program for Reverend Ernest Seckinger, and he lives in Young Harris, Georgia.
4 miles from the North Carolina line.
Okay, but you're a native of Effingham County.
Born where?
Good. Well, tell us a little bit about you, Reverend.
That's a deep subject. But my father was Frank Seckinger, and my mother was Gertrude Exley, the oldest daughter of Charlie Exley and Stella Dasher. So you see the Salisbury. My father's mother was Zitrow. And my father's father, of course, was called Seckinger. They were reared over at what they call Scuffletown,
Yeah.
around Pinora in that area.
So you got lots of Salisbury.
Oh yeah,
Stop.
on both sides. But my father, my grandfather, Seckinger, died when my father was 5 years old. He died of tuberculosis. And his mother died when he was 6. And there was about 10, 11 children in the family. The older children went to stay with relatives, but my father and Uncle Fred, who was 2 years older than my father, and Aunt May, and a younger child, all went to the Methodist Children's Home.
Where was the Methodist Children's?
It's in Macon, and it had just been established. My father was born April the 12th, 1887, and he was about 6 years old, you see, when he went to the home. And but they had a pretty rough time. Uncle Fred was sort of puny, and you can imagine 6 and 8-year-old boys. Somebody had to do some fighting. So they said my father, with big hands and stronger than ox, did Uncle Fred's fighting. But they spent about 6 years in the children's home there. They got some very good training. They went to the Vineville Methodist Church every Sunday, to Sunday school and church, and the public schools. And I think that's the reason my father was sort of a little notch above the average person, because he had broad-minded, wasn't quite as narrow-minded. And he never did take any part. One time, the last lynching that he knew about, somebody, a black man, accosted a Jadon girl, and all the neighbors said, "Let's go lynch that nigger." But my father said, "No, that's we're just taking the law in our own hands. You don't know whether it's guilty or not." Anyway, he didn't have any part of that kind of thing. But then when he was about 12 years old, he and Uncle Fred got out of the children's home, and he had a sister named Laura Cook. She married Arthur Cook. They lived over in the same Pinora area. And he got along fine, worked hard, but Arthur Cook didn't let him go to school much. And Uncle Willie Seckinger up at Clio, and Uncle David Seckinger, who later became county school superintendent, said, "Frank needs to be in school." So Uncle Willie said, "Frank, you come live with us." And he's 14, and he clerked for Rance Mallory in his grocery store there, and worked various other little jobs. But Uncle Willie said, "Frank, you need to get you some land." Well, Aunt Lula, Uncle Willie's wife, was a porter, and she knew an old couple of porters who had lots of land, and they had a family taking care of them. But it was a big place, and they said it wouldn't hurt to cut off 100 acres for Papa, And so he went and worked for that family all year. And he said, I worked hard, did everything right. But the family that was taking care of him was going to get the place, and they didn't want him to have any part of it. So they told the old couple, he said, Frank is no good, he won't work. And so they let him go. And all he got for that year of work was his board, of course, and a pair of overalls. Well, Raby Morgan's older brothers and some of his friends saw the injustice of the situation, and they said, Frank, you go to Jacksonville with us and we'll get you a job on the railroad. And his job was writing down the names and the numbers of the cars as they went by, you know, the freight cars. And if you missed one, you had to run it down. Pretty tough job. But he kept his nose clean and saved his money for a year or so, and came back and bought him a place up there sort of by the Jimmy Exley knows, Bonnet Exley. I don't know the name of that place, but the second place he bought was at Tusculum. But he was always wanting something a little bigger. So he traded that farm and bought the Frank Zitrow place, which is between Bartow Reese's place and the Harold Rowan place. It was a little bigger. It was a narrow strip of land, but he had some land back on the Runs Creek, we call it, Ebenezer Creek, it's the same. But, and he went hunting back there, and he met some turkeys back there, and saw some deer tracks. And before you knew it, he had sold that place and bought the old Zitrow place. It must have been because Governor Troutman's name was on the deed somehow. I think they gave it to the old Zitrow man because of his participation maybe in the Revolutionary War. But so that was sort of, and my brother Bernard was born August the 25th, 1915. And I was born May the 20th, 1917. And shortly after I was born, we moved over to that old place, back 1 mile off of the, you know, the highway. It's now 119, but it was just the Clio Springfield Road at the time. And my grandfather and James Zitrow's grandfather staked out that road in one day with an axe and so on, and they went by everybody's house, if you know that road. But when they got to Marshall Edwards, rather than going to Berrysville, they turned left, but if you look at that road, it just zigzags. By contrast, the road from Sisters Ferry on to Springfield that way is straight. It was laid out straight. But going back, my dad had that place. Now you say, how can a boy with a little bit of money from the railroad buy a place and trade? We had back then what we called the Federal Land Bank. And you could pay a little bit each year and keep your farm. And I don't know how long, I don't think there was any limit. But some years, the farmers didn't make enough to pay for the fertilizer. They call it guano. Of course, they had a lot of compost they used too. But Colonel Barger was the head of the Federal Land Bank here, and he understood the situation. He knew when it was dry, when he had a crop failure. So the farmers would go to him and he'd say, well, pay me a little interest. And next year they would, and you see, you couldn't, a farmer could go broke every year back then and still stay in business. Because you made sure that you had enough corn for the mule and enough stuff to go through, enough hogs to butcher, enough grits, corn, you could take it to the mill and get it ground up and meal. And if you had Georgia ice cream, I mean, if you had grits and eggs and ham and milk, you know, you could get along pretty good. And so it was hard to starve us to death. But that's sort of the background. Now my mother called that old place back there 265 acres, on about 60 acres in cultivation. She called it Bear's Nest. She didn't particularly like to be back there because those 11 brothers and sisters, Oliver, Exley, Lovick, Aunt Lolly married William Rowan, Aunt Erna married Linford Rowan, and all those folks, they loved each other. It was a sibling love that lasted a lifetime. And then the younger boys was Ray and Bell and Mark and Elbert. And I used to delight in calling him Uncle Elbert. Uncle Elbert, because he's about 2 years older than me, but I called him Uncle Elbert. But that's sort of our background. You heard of a 2-horse farm? Well, we didn't know anything about a 2-horse farm. We had a 2-mule farm. And I remember Pet was a little Tennessee mule, sort of short, but she had a good disposition. She'd bite you if you got too close, but we knew to stay away from the mouth and stay away from the heels. But she was gentle. You could plow a garden with her. But then when the Bernard got big enough to plow, we bought another mule. And that was a Missouri mule. And they were bigger and stronger. But she was a fool mule. And she almost made me cuss one time. Papa and Bernard did the plowing and I did the hoeing. And my job was to get all of the grass that they didn't get with the plow. Well, when Bernard went off to the Marines, he gave me old Kit in the new ground field, and I was siding something. And that mule wouldn't walk right, and you would holler at her and hit her with a line, and she'd go faster, and I was blessing her out. I don't remember, I almost cussed. I remember I said, you you daughter of a Jenny ass and jackass, why don't you walk straight, walk right? Well, Papa heard the commotion in another field, and before I knew it, he was right behind me walking up. He said, what's the problem, Ernest? I said, this fool mule won't walk right. And he said, let's see. And he took the lines and the plow handles and said, and she walked about 2 steps. He said, whoa. And he turned the plow stock over and got the monkey wrench that was always on the plow stock. And the sweep was so loose you could do it like that. No wonder I couldn't plow. But he tightened it up. He didn't fuss at me. He turned the plow back over and said, now see if the mule doesn't walk better. He didn't fuss at me, but he taught me something. I'm not sure I always remembered it. But he said, don't blame something on somebody else, particularly on a mule, because of your ignorance. Well, we had a time on that 2-mule farm and had a lot of fun. And we planted 10 acres of Irish potatoes. And you had to pick up we would put 2 mules to a middle buster, and so they would go out like that and they couldn't step on them. And then all we had to do was pick up every one of those potatoes in a big bucket and walk across the plowed field to a barrel. And we'd pour it until that barrel got full, and then we'd get some green tops and put on top so the sun wouldn't blister them, and you'd go on. And I think sometimes we used to make 100 barrels an acre. Good Lord. Every one of those potatoes had to be picked up, and then when you got ready to haul them to Berrysville, we had a farmers union back there. And we had a potato grater out there. And you'd take those potatoes over there and pour them in that grater, and the number 1s would come out like that. The number 2s, and you put each one a barrel, and the little curls, or the ones that got cut, they were in the coal barrel. And if Budrow said the market was good, you'd haul them over to the freight cars.
Now,
And-
who is Budrow?
He was a feller in Savannah that worked with the farmers in selling their produce. And sometimes Budrow would say, there's no market. He would sell up in New York and so on. And guess what? You couldn't pour them in the... So guess what you do? You'd bring them back home, and we had this sapling field with straw on it with no sun coming in, and we'd pour them out there and spread them out. And then about August or September, Budrow would say, we can sell some potatoes now. So we had to put 4 barrels out, and the big ones by hand were here in this barrel. Number 1, number 2, number 3, in the colors. I don't know that this happened, but you know, they told a lot of stories on the Irishmen because around the turn of the century, the Irish had a potato famine and they liked to starve to death, but those big, strong Irishmen, they liked to work and they'd come over here. And the farmers would hire them for a week to cut wood, because they'd cut all the wood you could use in a week to grind cane. Well, they say this big Irishman cut so much wood that by Wednesday night, the farmer said, we can't use any more wood, but we want you to help us go down and grade those potatoes. And at noon on Thursday, the big Irishman, they say, came in all sweated down. He said, wood, I can cut it. But he said, them decisions are getting me down. Well, that's sort of the way. And the year that you couldn't pay your fertilizer bill, your fertilizer man would sort of wait till the next fall, until the next year you had a crop. And Mr. Elman Bragg ran a union store that cooperative people had, you know, it was a cooperative store. And we didn't have any money much, but we had some chickens. And we'd gather eggs. And we'd take the eggs to Mr. Elman. And he'd see how many dozen eggs you had. And he'd give you credit for those eggs. And then you'd go get some groceries. And it was hard to starve us to death because Cap Burns had a grist mill where the old camp meeting was originally, old campground. But he would pour your corn in his hopper, but he would take out what he needed to charge you. So it didn't cost you anything, and if you wanted meal, fine, he'd grow that for cornbread. If you wanted grits for hominy, or now we call it Georgia ice cream, he'd do that. And even one year we planted rice in a low spot in the field, and if it happened to rain at the right time, it was just right. We made some good rice out where, right back of where Donald and Francis live now. But his rice mill wasn't the state of the art, and it would sort of crack it up, and you didn't have the whole grains. And anything that we raised, we didn't think was as good as store-bought stuff. My uncles would come back to Grandpapa Charlie's for Sunday dinner, and they'd bring bought bread, light bought bread. Man, we thought that was the best stuff. You could put it in a plate and put a little bit of milk on the bottom and put some regular sweet cream that rose up off of the milk that you just milked that morning, and then put some syrup on it. And man, that was good eating. It had a little cholesterol, but we never heard of cholesterol. And we worked it off. We'd out on the farm and on the baseball and going swimming and everything. But Grandpapa Charlie, all those 10, 11 children usually came back on Sunday. And Grandmother Stella, man, she'd work all day Saturday, and she'd have a big Sunday dinner. And I thought, you know, that's the way it always was. And so I spent a week with Grandpa one time, and guess what? They didn't have all that fried chicken. They had turnip greens and rice and grits and maybe for breakfast they'd have an egg and stuff like that. And we didn't just play all the time. he had a field on it, we called it the river field, about beyond Freddie Helmet down there, must have been 2 miles. And they'd get in the wagon, and some of the Goldwire, Catherine Goldwire and her family would help them, and we'd all ride to the river field, and we had a little old lunch we'd take, and it took him about, I think, a long time to get there, a long time to come back, but it was a pretty good field, and I think that river field was part of the revolutionary, one of the exodus that fought in the Revolutionary War, and they got that. That was a place to be that time on the river field.
Well, when you're talking about the river field, isn't that part of the old Bethany property,
Well,
the
that's
Salzburgers?
where they were buried, yeah.
No, but I'm talking about the piece of land you're talking about, they call Riverfield, that wasn't what Mel owned?
Yeah, Mel owned it. And,
Okay,
and
now-
then,
and that was part of the original grant from
Right.
when they settled Bethany, isn't that right? The same
I think
land?
so, because the Exodus were part of that Bethany, and so were the Seckingers. But then we would have to go a little further to go to Gaffney Landing. And
Now,
we would,
what were you riding in?
brand new Cadillac. Well, as you know, we didn't have nothing then but the mule and wagon.
Human way.
We didn't have any tractors. But man, we had fun. We would go down there and camp at that place, Gaffney Landing, and you had little boats you could go across the river in those lagoons of them. Man, they could catch the fish, and we would set out lines, and Grandpapa knew how to take a cotton ball and some dough and make something that you could catch carp with. I don't know why he caught those carp, because I got a recipe for fixing the carp. They said put him on a board, salt and pepper, good, and let him cook for 4 hours in the oven, and then take him out and throw the fish away and eat the board. So, but anyway, we'd set out lines, and we would go squirrel hunting in the afternoon, and then we'd cook the squirrels and we'd cook the fish. And I remember one time I was old enough to sort of feel a little lonely out there, and looked at the moon, and I wasn't interested in girls, because when I was in the 6th grade, my teacher said, Ernest, you ought to write better, because someday you want to write to a girl. I said, what? I remember how sorry I felt for that ignorant teacher that wanted me to write a girl. But we had a great time. We didn't have a lot of games, but we had a lot of fun. We fished and hunted and played hoop and hide, and had a big time. But that was sort of our growing up.
Tell me about hoop and hide.
Well, one fellow, he's got to put his hands over his head, lean up against a post, and he counts to 50. And when he says 49, 50, I'm coming, ready or not. And they had all hidden around behind the places. And then he would sneak around, and if a person would sneak back of him and beat him back to the base, he was then safe. But if he saw a fellow and beat him back to the base, then he was it. And he had to hide, and the rest of them he had to be it. And that was called hoop and hide. But we had a lot of games like that. My brother and I sort of ran out of games one time, and there was an old ash tree that the original Zitrows, when they moved the old house from down close to the little branch and within 200 yards of the Runs Creek, they moved it up about half a mile up on higher ground, and they set out some walnut trees and some ash trees. They set out a big live oak and a big ash tree. And when I was a boy, that ash tree would bloom. I mean, the laurel tree would bloom, and it was shady under that oak, and you could look out to the left and there was that cypress pond, and the moon would come up over that cypress pond. That was what I call magic beauty. But my brother and I, we didn't have any candy. We just had to make our own thing. So there was a little hole about that big in each one of those ash roots, right side by side. And so we got us a hammer, and we got some black walnuts. Now, have you ever tried to eat black walnuts? It's the best way I know to starve to death. With a nail, picking them out, it's so slow. So I was picking out some walnuts, and I was about to starve to death, so I began to put me a little pile over here. And I reached back to get a walnut, and Bernard, bless his heart, was hungry too, and he had my picked out walnuts and eating them. Now, my wife said that I shouldn't say this in public, but I just did the natural thing. The hammer was right there, and I just popped him in the head. Well, my mother introduced me to the Board of Education. He still has a scar there. But when you steal somebody's walnuts, that's a serious offense. But later, we didn't have anything to play, so we were going to play snake. And I had a long rope, an old plow line that it was sort of rotted. And he had an axe, and he was going to kill that snake. And he could, 2 years older than me, could run a little faster. But I was making time because my snake was getting shorter and shorter. And that old house was maybe 3 feet off the pillars. And I made a dart under there to escape. And he wanted the last part of that snake, but he got my right leg just above my knee. Well, he didn't mean to do it. So my mother didn't whip him, but she said, now, it's going to take him a little while to get well. She treated it perfectly, just put a little kerosene on it, put a clean white rag wrapped up around it. But as I remember, that thing took a long time to get well, because Mother said, Bernard, the least you can do is to bring in Ernest stovewood until his leg gets well. So I think it took a long time. But I tell you what, Bernard has never stolen any more walnuts. And I have never played snake again. But we had to think up things to do back then. But I tell you, as I look back on those early years with Bernard and Ernest growing up but 2 years apart, sometimes it was sort of rough. The brotherly love that we shared wasn't always too tame. We'd fight and stuff. But I want you to know, after all these years, I don't hold any hard feelings toward him, and he doesn't hold any toward me, I think, but he hadn't stolen any more walnuts. But when I finished high school, I decided that I was going into the ministry. He was in the Marines making $21 a month. And he came home to camp meeting and said, Ernest, I understand you want to be a preacher. I said, I don't particularly want to be, but I feel I've got to be. The closer I get to God, the stronger. But he said, well, you're going to have to go to school. You don't know enough to be a preacher. I said, I know that. He said, where do you want to go to school? I said, Young Harris College. He said, what you going to do for money? I said, man, I got $55. I had worked for Jack Barnell in the Chevrolet dealership